to another episode of Uncommon Conversations, the conversations we like to have about faith, science, ethics, politics. And I'm John, and
I'm Seth.
And Seth is here to join me for a conversation about virtue. So tension, I feel that exists within teaching, especially as more emphasis has been placed upon gospel and teaching Jesus and reading scripture through the lens of Jesus, all these kind of things that come up from Reformed circles to Anabaptist circles, whatever it is then causes a tension with maybe the past way of teaching, and that is, what then is the place for virtue in teaching the scriptures? What then is the place for teaching character, good character? Right. In scripture, it's the old line of, who is it? Christian Smith, moral therapeutic deism, right? Yep. You know, all that was left of the crust of Christian teaching was just how to be a good person. Yep. And so there's been a big swing against that, and a lot of really good teaching now about, like, let's get to who Jesus is and the story of Scripture and all these kind of things. But have we thrown away teachings of virtue? And what role does teaching of virtue have within the church? What do you think, man?
Well, let's start with the Bible. It's a good place to start as believers in Christ. So when I think about what the Bible looks like, generally the New Testament, other than the Gospels and Acts and Revelation, there are letters, right? There are epistles. Yeah. And in those epistles, there's all kinds of teaching, right? Yeah. Teaching about who God is, who we are as a people of God, what the world looks like, both what we can see and beyond what we can see. But there's almost inevitably in each of those letters some sort of turn from doctrine to teaching, from orthodoxy to orthopraxy.
Sure.
So some sort of turn to, all right, now that we know this, let's live our lives a certain way.
Sure.
You know, in view of Christ, in view of our adoption as children of God, in view of whatever.
You're right.
And so even right there on the pages of Scripture, we see time and time again what virtue looks like.
Sure.
What virtue for us as believers ought to be, you know. And granted, of course, those were specific letters to specific communities. Sure. And sometimes specific people. But there has always been in Judaism and then Christianity an impulse to connect what we know about God and about the world to our lives, and to say it's all about the gospel, right? Yeah, right. As important as that is, sure, as a foundation and as a center. If the gospel just leads to knowledge, right, or just leads to, I don't know, a catchy song or whatever it might lead to, if it doesn't lead to some sort of difference in life, you know, James talks about how if faith without works is dead.
Yeah, sure.
And so somehow that gospel has to take root and I think shape us. And I think the most specific example of how gospel and works relates is in Ephesians 2, where we see that once we have this faith, once we have this salvation, in verse 10 it talks about now we've been created for good works, right? So it doesn't just stop with this newness of life. This newness of life, this salvation, it has an end, and that end in the future, of course, is union with God. But the end now is to live a life that's worthy of the gospel and to live a life that looks like the life of Christ, which we know is what the life of God looks like.
Yeah. No, that to me hits right on. I think if you stop the gospel short of virtuous teaching, I think you stop the gospel short of its telos, like its right, end. And the end is, hey, if Jesus is the resurrected King, and he gives us resurrected life, like he puts a spirit in us, then our ends, like you said, ultimately is union with God. But in the meantime, while we're here, it's to live a good and beautiful life. Right? Not to use, that's James Smith's words, but to live the virtuous life. Like, we are to be like perfect reflections of God's goodness and his creation. We're to be virtuous people here as now new creations and part of new creation. And so I think all of this talk of And I was here for a period of time, and that was probably because I needed to like recenter myself after maybe some bad years of growing up with bad Bible teaching, to like center myself on what is the gospel.
With heteropraxy. Right.
You know, like what really is the gospel. And
Right.
so for me, like it was refreshing to have all these times of like, what is the gospel and what is the story of Scripture and all of these type of things.
Yeah.
But I think if you're still to stop there, or if you take as can often be, you take the off ramp onto just talking about theology,
Right.
where you're just like, oh, we just need to know more about God, know more about God. Well, the purpose of what our knowledge about God is, as you say, is it then should affect how we live.
Right.
You know, one of the things when we our church, when we talked through our confession of faith, was, why is this important at all for us? And we framed it in the terms of, these are the beliefs about God that compel us to action. You know, like they aren't just beliefs about God because they're the right beliefs about God and we want to defend truth. They are truth. But why they're important is because, you know, as I'll say, the character of the king determines the character of the kingdom. Like who we believe God is determines how we should live.
Right.
And so, So where do you find that balance in your teaching? Because you do play a role in teaching, and so do I. So where is it just about, okay, this is Jesus, this is the story of Scripture. Where do you make that transition to, okay, here's the virtuous life. Where's the call to virtue?
Yeah, I think for me, every point of theology, every aspect of doctrine, for the most part, and I haven't thought of any that have none, but for the most part, they have an aspect of virtue, right? So as we see what the character of God is, virtue is conforming to the character of God. And so knowing who God is, thereby we also see how to be like that in some ways. And of course, you know, it could be hard, or it could be mysterious, or it could be kind of above what we think we can do in this life. But just the very simple point, if there is such a simple point in theology, as God being Trinity, right? So God being Trinity, that's been abused in a lot of ways.
Simple point.
Right? That's been abused in a lot of ways
in
terms of what it means.
Sure.
But at its core, somehow it means that God is community. And therefore, we, made in the image of God, also are communal beings.
Yeah.
So we, in our nature, yearn for that unity, that community with God and with each other.
Yeah.
And so like that right there, you know, that's one point. And the list goes on. If we are teaching things about God that have no traction in real life at all, then our theology, it may not be wrong, but it's not whole.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, I think about this in terms of whenever I teach. I think if I'm going to teach somebody about God, it is going to detonate. It's going to end. Detonate, it's probably a scary term. It's going to end. It's going to terminate, right? And maybe the academic sense. Its terminal end is going to be a call for us. That application is going to be, okay, if God is like this, then therefore what do we do? And I don't think the answer ever in Scripture is we do nothing. Right? Like I think there's, whether it's just worship in response to who God is, or it's if this is how God acts as far as he's humble, he's loving, like whatever, then it becomes a call for us to reflect that.
So you're not a quietist then?
Explain that.
So in quietism, you have this experience with God, but you realize, nothing I can do about it. Mm-hmm. So God's going to do what God's going to do, and I'm just going to sort of passively allow God to do what God's going to do, and that's that.
No, I don't think the life of discipleship is a passive life.
No, I don't think so.
Not at all. Anyways, final thoughts, man.
When you read Scripture, or when you hear from preachers, or whatever you're doing out there, always have this understanding of praxis in your mind. Like, you don't have to get there right away, but somehow what you're reading, what you're hearing needs to have some effect in your life. Otherwise, it's not good for much more than knowing the stuff.
All right. Final word on virtue and teaching. Hey, thanks a lot, guys.